The galaxy had a rhythm, a chaotic but predictable pulse of war and trade, of empires rising from stardust and crumbling into forgotten footnotes. For centuries, the Cathar Imperium had been the dominant beat in that rhythm, their fleets like a mailed fist, their word law. They were not subtle, but they were consistent. Their power was measured in plasma yields and subjugated worlds, a currency everyone understood. Then the static came. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a feeling, a subtle wrongness on the edge of perception, like a single note played off-key in a symphony of cosmic background radiation. It started in the outer rim, in the junk lanes and pirate havens where the Imperium's grip was weakest. A listening post near the Obsidian Veil, a sector of space so dense with stellar debris it was considered impassable, went silent. No distress call, no final data scream, just a sudden, perfect quiet. The Cathar sent a scout vessel, the Iron Talon, commanded by a young, ambitious officer named Kira. She was eager to prove herself, to carve her name into the annals of the Imperium. She found the listening post intact, floating in the silent dark, its lights still blinking in their automated patterns. But the crew was gone. Every single one of them. Vanished. The only thing they left behind was a single, repeating data fragment logged in the final moments before the silence. It wasn't a warning or a message. It was a word, repeated over and over in a language no one had heard in 500 years. Hush. Kara's report was dismissed by High Command as a pirate raid, a new stealth technology perhaps. They sent a battle group to pacify the sector, to make a loud and bloody example. The battle group, led by the legendary Grand Admiral Vorlag on his flagship, the World Breaker, jumped into the Obsidian Veil. They expected to find raiders or a rival faction's secret weapon. They found nothing. For 3 days, they swept the sector, their powerful sensors probing the dense asteroid fields. On the 4th day, the static returned, but this time it was more than a feeling. It was a presence. The World Breaker's long-range sensors picked up an object, something impossibly large, drifting out from the heart of the veil. It didn't register on any known ship classification. It had no heat signature, no energy output, no drive emissions. It was a hole in space, a shape defined only by the stars it blotted out. Vorlag, a veteran of 100 campaigns, a being whose name alone made planets tremble, felt a tremor of unease. He ordered a full scan, but the sensor arrays returned nonsense data, corrupted and illogical, as if they were trying to measure a paradox. The object was a ghost, a phantom of impossible scale. He hailed it, demanding identification in the name of the Cathar Imperium. The only reply was a deepening of the silence, a crushing pressure that seemed to settle over his fleet. Then, the static coalesced into a voice. It wasn't broadcast over the comms. It was felt in the mind of every crew member across the battle group simultaneously, from the Grand Admiral on his throne-like command chair to the lowliest engine greaser in the ship's bowels. It was a calm, dispassionate voice, ancient and weary, speaking the same forgotten language as the listening post's final log. But this time, everyone understood it, not with their ears, but with a primal part of their brain that recognized a predator. The voice said, "You have made so much noise. We have come to listen to the quiet." Vorlag, his composure cracking for the first time in his long career, ordered his fleet to open fire. A storm of plasma bolts and kinetic slugs, enough firepower to crack a small moon, raced toward the silent giant. But the weapons never hit. They simply ceased. Not deflected, not absorbed, but erased from existence in the void between the Cathar fleet and the unknown vessel. No flash, no impact, no debris. They were just gone. A moment of stunned silence hung over the World Breaker's bridge. Then, the voice returned, its tone unchanged, carrying not a hint of malice, but something far more chilling finality. Your sound is over. In that instant, half of Vorlog's battle group vanished, not destroyed in explosions of fire and shrapnel, but blinked out of reality as if they had never been. One moment, the ships were there, their running lights defiant against the darkness. The next, there was only empty space where they had been. Panic shattered the disciplined Cathar crews. Ships broke formation, their captains screaming contradictory orders. Vorlag stood frozen on his bridge, staring at the empty tactical display, the ghost of his vanished fleet mocking him. He had faced down fleets, crushed rebellions, and burned worlds. But this was not war. This was pest control. The survivors of the battle group limped back to Cathar Prime, their data logs corrupted, their crews speaking of ghosts and silent gods. High Command, in an act of supreme denial, classified the event as a catastrophic navigational error within the Veil's treacherous asteroid fields. Grand Admiral Vorlag was quietly retired, his legacy tainted by whispers of madness. The official narrative was that the Imperium remained untouchable, but Kira knew better. She had seen the raw data from the Iron Talon, the clean, surgical silence of the listening post, and she felt the lie in her bones. The word hush was not a pirate's taunt, it was a command. While the Imperium's war machine began grinding toward the construction of a new, even grander fleet to project an image of unbroken strength, Kira began a different kind of hunt, reassigned to a dreary data archival post as a subtle punishment for her unsettling report. She used her low-level access to dive into the Imperium's deepest, most forgotten records. She searched for the language, for any mention of a civilization that simply went quiet. She waded through digital oceans of redacted military histories, expunged cultural exchanges, and forbidden xenological studies. Most leads were dead ends, whispers of forgotten races that had destroyed themselves or been swallowed by stellar phenomena. But then she founded a footnote in a heavily censored file on the First Expansionary War, 5 centuries past. It mentioned a species known as humanity. They were described as volatile, brilliant, and dangerously unpredictable. They had spread across their arm of the galaxy like a firestorm, their technology advancing at a rate that terrified their neighbors. They fought with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. Yet they also created art of breathtaking beauty and philosophies that question the very nature of existence. The Cathar, then a young and aggressive empire, had clashed with them along a contested border. The reports were fragmented, but they spoke of human ships that didn't just fight, they adapted, evolving their tactics and technology mid-battle. The Kiar had won the war, or so the official histories claimed, securing the territory and pushing humanity back. But Kira found a sealed addendum, a personal log from a long-dead intelligence officer. It painted a different picture. It claimed humanity had not been defeated. They had simply stopped. In the middle of a massive campaign, at the height of their power, their fleets had halted, their colonies had gone dark, and their communications had ceased. They had collectively universally gone silent. The officer had theorized it wasn't a retreat, but a transcendence. He wrote, "They did not lose the war. They lost interest in it. They looked at our endless, screaming cycle of conquest and ambition and chose to turn away. They are not gone. They are waiting for the noise to stop." Kira felt a cold dread crystallize in her gut. She cross-referenced stellar cartography, comparing ancient human territory with the location of the Obsidian Veil. It was a perfect match. The impassable field of debris wasn't a natural formation. It was a border wall, a self-imposed exile. The listening post had been built too close. A noisy neighbor next to a house that had demanded quiet for 500 years. And Vorlog's battle group hadn't stumbled upon a random anomaly. They had knocked on the door of a sleeping giant and demanded it bow. The static was not a weapon. It was the giant stirring, annoyed by the incessant racket. Kira knew she had to warn someone, but who would listen? The Imperium was a machine built on pride and momentum. To admit that a species they had relegated to a historical footnote had returned as a godlike entity was impossible. It would shatter the very foundation of their power. Her superiors would brand her a traitor, a heretic spreading fear. But as she sat in the cold, humming silence of the archive, staring at the officer's final, chilling entry, "They will not return to fight us. They will return to correct us," she realized the alternative was far worse. To do nothing was to allow the Cathar Imperium to continue its deafening war march right into the heart of a silence that would swallow it whole. The humans hadn't come back for revenge. They had come back to turn down the volume. And for the first time, Kira understood that the greatest threat to her people wasn't a rival fleet or a new weapon. It was the terrifying, absolute peace that was coming for them all. She had to make them listen before the entire galaxy was hushed for good. Kira didn't run. Running was loud. Instead, she moved with a quiet deliberation that was the antithesis of everything the Cathar Imperium stood for. She sliced the forbidden data from the archival mainframes, encrypting it not with military-grade firewalls that screamed their presence, but with layers of obsolete, forgotten code that would look like digital dust to any prying sensor sweep. She walked out of the archives not as a fugitive, but as a ghost, her official identity scrubbed by her own hand, replaced with the ghost profile of a low-level cargo hauler who had died of a plasma conduit rupture 3 years prior. Her first destination was a place of noise, a sprawling, chaotic trade port on the moon of Xylos, a place of 1,000 shouting merchants, clanging cargo lifters, and the incessant thrum of overworked atmospheric processors. It was the perfect place to hide from a power that only looked for large, obvious threats. She sought out a man as obsolete as the code she now hid behind her former tutor, a disgraced historian named Valerius. He had been cast out of the Imperial Academy for his heretical theory that the Cathar's relentless expansion was not a sign of strength, but a symptom of cultural insecurity. A civilization so terrified of silence it had to fill every void with the sound of its own marching boots. She found him in a cramped, dusty shop filled with forgotten books and humming data slates, a tiny island of quiet thought in a sea of clamor. He was older, thinner, but his eyes still held the sharp, inquisitive light she remembered. When she laid the data slate on his counter, he initially waved it away, assuming it was another trinket for sale. But when she whispered the single word she had taken from the listening post, Hush's eyes widened, and he ushered her into the back room without another word. For hours, They sat in the dim light as Valerius sifted through the data, the pristine silence of the listening post, the corrupted sensor logs from the World Breaker, the fragmented historical file on humanity's great disappearance. He didn't speak, but Kira watched the blood drain from his face. When he was finished, he sat back, his hands trembling slightly. They called it the Great Retreat, he murmured, his voice raspy with disuse. My grandfather used to tell me stories, myths of a species that could rewrite physics with their thoughts, who built cities of living glass. The official records call them primitives who overextended and collapsed. It was a lie, a foundational lie to justify our own manifest destiny. He stood and paced the small room. The Imperium won't listen. Kira, to them, this is a nail that needs a bigger hammer. They will see this as a challenge, not a warning. As if on cue, a public news feed on a nearby screen flickered to life. The stern, armored face of the new Grand Marshal, a hardliner named Kale, filled the screen. He spoke of the treacherous anomaly in the Obsidian Veil and announced the commissioning of the Aegis Fleet, a new generation of warships 10 times the size of the World Breaker, their primary weapons designed not to fire plasma, but to tear holes in space-time itself. We will meet silence with thunder, Kale roared, and the broadcast cut to cheering crowds and schematics of the new, monstrous ships. A countdown clock appeared in the corner of the screen. The Aegis fleet would be launched in 3 months. Valerius let out a bitter laugh. Thunder, he spat. They are children banging drums to scare away the dark, not realizing the dark is listening. The cleansing, as Kira had begun to call it in her mind, was not limited to the Imperium's borders. News, heavily censored but still seeping through unofficial channels, began to trickle in from other parts of the galaxy. The Wraithak Pirates, a notorious syndicate whose reign of terror was a constant, violent static in the Outer Rim, vanished. An entire asteroid belt they had hollowed out into a fortress was found perfectly intact, but utterly empty. Every soul aboard gone. The only clue was a message burned into the command center's main view screen, not in any language, but in a perfect, geometric spiral, a visual representation of silence. A week later, the Quor, a species of telepathic zealots who broadcasted their deafening, compulsory prayers across a dozen systems, fell quiet, their God signal, a psychic scream that had driven unshielded species to madness, simply stopped. A trade vessel passing through their territory reported their worlds were still there, still populated, but the inhabitants moved with a serene, unnerving calm. They no longer broadcasted their faith. They simply existed, their collective psychic presence now a placid, silent lake where a raging storm had once been. The humans were not just removing threats. They were editing out dissonance. They were tuning the galaxy. And the Cathar Imperium was the most discordant instrument in the orchestra. They're not moving towards us, Kira realized aloud, staring at a galactic map Valerius had projected onto the wall, the silent systems marked with a soft, pulsing light. They're moving around us. They're isolating us. They're quieting the neighborhood before dealing with the noisy house party. Valerius nodded, pointing to a system on the very edge of what had once been human space. If we are to have any hope, it's there. System 734 officially listed as a barren rock, but forbidden texts refer to it as Echo's Rest. They say the humans left behind artifacts, sentinels, things that would bear witness to their return. He pulled up a grainy image from a centuries-old probe. It showed a desolate planet, and on its surface, a single impossibly thin spire that seemed to absorb the light of its star. The legends call it the Spire of Whispers. It wasn't a weapon. It was a library of last resorts, a testament to why they left. If it is still there, if it can be activated, it might give us the one thing we need proof that can't be dismissed as madness or treason. The plan was insane. They were two insignificant beings, a disgraced historian and a ghost operative, hunted by an empire that refused to see the abyss it was marching towards. They would have to steal a ship, navigate treacherous, patrol-heavy star lanes, and journey to a mythical place to activate an alien artifact, all before the Aegis fleet launched and signed the Imperium's death warrant. It was a fool's errand. "We'll need a ship," Kira said, her voice firm, "and a pilot who doesn't ask questions." Their journey began in the scrapyards of Xylos, a metallic graveyard where ships came to die. Here, Valerius used his meager savings to hire a grizzled Zortan pilot named Grusk, a being with 4 arms, no sense of loyalty beyond the highest bidder, and a ship that looked like it was held together by rust and spite. The stray comet was a far cry from the sleek warships Kira was used to, but it was small. Its energy signature was a chaotic mess that blended in with cosmic background noise, and Grusk knew how to fly it through forgotten hyperspace routes that Imperial patrols had long since abandoned. As they traveled, the news from the Imperium grew more grim. High Command had initiated a purge, arresting anyone who questioned the official narrative about the Obsidian Veil incident. Scholars, junior officers, even a few high-ranking officials who had quietly voiced their concerns were rounded up and charged with sedition. The Imperium was silencing its own dissent, adding its own ignorant noise to the cacophony. The journey to Echo's Rest was tense. They dodged patrols, bribed information brokers in lawless asteroid stations, and listened as the galaxy around them grew quieter. More systems fell silent. A financial hub whose predatory algorithms created chaos and collapse was found inert, its data centers wiped clean. A single, elegant equation left on its central server that, when solved, proved that stability was more profitable than greed. A slaver empire, the Scourge of Karth, was found adrift in their own fleets, their minds wiped of all aggression, now tending to their former captives with a gentle, vacant kindness. The message was becoming clearer with every passing day. Humanity was not destroying, it was rebalancing. They were a force of cosmic entropy, not reversing chaos, but resolving it into a state of perfect, simple, and terrifying order. Finally, after weeks of travel, the stray comet dropped out of hyperspace into System 734. Before them hung the planet Echo's Rest. It was a sphere of gray, lifeless rock, just as the records had described, and there, rising from its equator, was the spire. It was blacker than the void of space, a sliver of absolute nothingness that drank the light of the nearby star. As they descended, the ship's instruments began to fail, not with static or error messages, but by simply going quiet. The engine hummed, then faded. The life support hissed, then went silent. Yet, they were still moving, still breathing. The spire was controlling their descent, pulling them down with a force that was not gravity. Grusk, for the first time, looked afraid. "This ain't tech," he grumbled, his 4 hands hovering uselessly over the dead controls. This is something else. The ship landed without a tremor at the base of the spire. The airlock opened on its own. Kira and Valerius stepped out onto the gray dust of a world that had not known a living footstep for half a millennium. The silence was absolute, a physical weight that pressed in on them. There was no wind, no geologic activity, nothing. It was the sound of a universe holding its breath. The spire had no entrance. It was a smooth, unbroken surface. As they approached, Valerius stumbled, his hand brushing against the black surface. The moment he made contact, it began. It wasn't a sound or a light. It was a feeling, a memory, flooding their minds directly. They felt the psychic scream of a billion souls across 1,000 worlds, the noise of constant war, the shriek of pointless cruelty, the drone of insatiable greed, the cacophony of 1,000 species all shouting over one another in a desperate, meaningless bid for dominance. They felt the weariness of humanity, a species that could hear it all, that felt every violent, selfish impulse as a physical blow. They experienced the moment of their great retreat, not as a decision, but as a biological imperative. Like a body rejecting a poison, they had not fled. They had recoiled. The spire showed them the 5 centuries of quiet observation, of watching the noise grow louder, more discordant, until finally, a threshold was crossed. The listening post near the veil had been the final, ignorant shout in a library of sleeping gods. The psychic vision ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Kira on her knees, gasping, tears streaming down her face. Valerius lay nearby, curled into a ball, muttering, "We were the static. We were always the static." Kira now understood. This wasn't a war they could win with bigger ships or better weapons. It wasn't a war at all. It was a cure, and the Cathar Imperium was the disease. Looking up at the silent, impassive spire, she knew her mission had changed. It was no longer about warning her people. It was about pleading for them. How do you convince a god that the screeching of an insect is worth sparing? How do you teach a storm to be quiet? Her proof was not a weapon. It was a confession, and she was now the reluctant bearer of her entire species' original sin. The spire did not release them. After the torrent of shared memory, a new sensation settled over them, not a story, but a state of being. The silence of the planet was no longer a weight, it was a medium, and through it, Kira felt a presence. It wasn't a voice, but an awareness, ancient and vast, studying her, sifting through her intentions with a dispassionate curiosity. It was the spire itself, or the intelligence that inhabited it, a sentinel left to guard a truth the galaxy had long forgotten. You are Cathar, the awareness impressed upon her mind. Your species' signature is dissonance, a persistent, grating frequency in the cosmic harmony. Why do you seek to preserve it, Kira? Still on her knees in the gray dust, pushed herself up. She didn't try to broadcast a thought in reply. She knew it would be a clumsy shout in this realm of perfect quiet. Instead, she focused on a feeling, a memory of her own, a childhood memory of watching a colony of Cathar weaver ants build a complex, beautiful nest. They were loud, chaotic, constantly bumping into each other, yet from their noise, a perfect functional structure emerged. It was an argument, a plea without words. Our noise is not just destruction. It is also the sound of creation, of striving. It is imperfect, but it is life. The awareness paused, considering this. Imperfect life creates exponential chaos. Chaos is the enemy of duration. Your striving will inevitably lead to your own erasure. We are merely accelerating the process to minimize collateral damage. The cold logic was irrefutable, terrifying. They weren't being punished. They were being pruned. A gardener trimming a branch that threatened the health of the entire tree. Valerius finally stirred, his face ashen. He had felt it too. "It's a balance equation," he whispered, his voice sounding shockingly loud in the stillness. "They see the universe as a complex system, and we are a variable that always trends toward instability. They're not angry. They're just debugging." Back on the stray comet, Grusk was having his own encounter. The ship's systems had slowly, silently come back online, but they were different. The chaotic energy signature he was so proud of had been smoothed out. The engine, once a rattling beast, now purred with a quiet, impossible efficiency. On his main console, a single, elegant spiral of light pulsed softly. When he touched it, his mind was filled not with visions of galactic history, but with a simple, perfect schematic of his own ship, showing him how to reroute a dozen power conduits to triple its efficiency and render it nearly invisible to any sensor grid. It was not a command, but a gift, a lesson in quiet design. When Kira and Valerius returned to the ship, they found the pilot staring at his console in awed silence. "It fixed it," Grusk stammered. "It made it better, quieter." The spire had not only judged them, it had taught them. As they lifted off from Echo's rest, no longer pulled but released, the spire impressed one final thought into Kira's mind. It was not a promise or a threat. It was a condition. "Show us a new sound." The journey back was a race against the doomsday clock of the Aegis fleet's launch. The galaxy they traveled through was transforming. The silence was spreading, but it wasn't a void. Systems that had once been violent or chaotic were now harmonious. Trade routes functioned with perfect efficiency. Previously warring factions now engaged in silent, productive cooperation, their old grievances seemingly forgotten, overwritten by a new, logical imperative. The humans were not just silencing the noise, they were composing a new symphony, and entire civilizations were becoming its orchestra. Kira realized with a sickening lurch that they were not just saving the Sithar from destruction, but from irrelevance. In this new, quiet galaxy, a loud, aggressive empire like their own would be an ugly, obsolete relic. When they arrived back in the Xylos system, they found it changed. The chaotic clamor of the trade port was gone. The merchants still traded, but with a calm, silent efficiency. Their deals conducted over datapads with minimal fuss. The cargo lifters moved in synchronized, silent patterns. The noise had been replaced by a hum of pure productivity. It was peaceful. It was horrifying. They had been gone for weeks, and the Aegis fleet was only days from its launch. They needed to get the Spire's message, the shared memory, the confession of their species' history to the highest echelons of power. But High Command was a fortress sealed off by paranoia and pride. Any direct approach was impossible. It was Valerius who devised the plan, a piece of academic heresy so audacious it was brilliant. "We can't break down the door," he said, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light, "so we must poison the library." The Cathar Imperium's greatest strength and greatest weakness was its centralized historical archive, the Kronos Vault. Every ship, every station, every planetary governor constantly synced with it, updating records, tactical data, and official histories. It was the bedrock of their shared identity. It was also, Valerius theorized, a single point of failure. Using the new, hyper-efficient systems the Spire had gifted their ship, they could piggyback a data packet onto the constant, galaxy-wide sync signal. It would be a virus, but not one that destroyed. It would be a virus that revealed. It would insert the forbidden history of humanity, the truth of the Great Retreat, and the psychic echo of the Spire's message directly into the Kronos Vault. It wouldn't be flagged as a threat because it would be formatted as a legitimate historical update, signed with the archaic, forgotten encryption of the First Expansionary War. The system would see it as a lost file finally being restored to its rightful place. Once it was in the vault, it would be disseminated across the entire Imperium in a single, silent, unstoppable wave. Every Cathar with access to a data terminal, from the Grand Marshal on his throne to a lowly recruit on a forgotten outpost, would have the truth at their fingertips. Getting close enough to the central sync relay on Cathar Prime was the challenge. The capital was now a fortress, its orbital space swarming with patrols, its sensor grid on high alert, searching for any sign of human incursion. They were looking for a silent giant, not a tiny, obsolete freighter with a Zortan pilot who could now fly his ship as if it were a ghost. Grusk, energized by his ship's newfound perfection, navigated the blockade with a terrifying grace. He drifted through sensor nets like a phantom, using the gravitational shadows of moons and larger warships to mask their approach. As they neared the massive, orbiting sync relay, Kyra prepared the data packet. Her hands were steady, but her heart pounded a loud, chaotic rhythm in her chest. She wasn't launching a weapon, she was detonating a truth bomb, and she had no idea if the blast would save her people or shatter them completely. With a final command, the packet was sent, a whisper of data on a river of light. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, alarms began to blare across the Cathar Prime Defense Network, but they weren't alarms for an attack. They were system integrity alarms, thousands of them. As the Kronos Vault began to process a historical paradox it couldn't resolve. On the bridge of the Imperator, the flagship of the soon-to-be-launched Aegis fleet, Grand Marshal Kale watched the integrity alerts with fury. "Report," he bellowed. An aide, his face pale, stammered. "Sir, it's the vault. It's updating with files from the First Expansionary War." Kale frowned. "What files?" "Sir, it's about the humans. It says we didn't win. It says they left." The truth spread like a contagion. On warships, pilots read the logs of their predecessors who spoke of humanity's terrifying adaptability. In academies, students read the philosophical treatises of a species that questioned the morality of conquest. In government offices, bureaucrats saw the unredacted casualty reports from a war they had supposedly dominated. The foundational lie that had fueled their empire for 500 years was dissolving in real time. But the most profound impact was the Spire's message. It wasn't just text, it was the psychic echo, the shared experience of the galaxy's pain, the weariness of the Watchers. For the first time, the Cathar people felt the true cost of their noise. Riots didn't break out. That would have been too loud. Instead, a quiet, spreading paralysis took hold. Soldiers lowered their weapons, staring into space. Workers stepped away from their assembly lines. On the bridge of the Imperator, Grand Marshal Kale read the final, damning entry from the Forgotten Intelligence Officer. They are not gone. They are waiting for the noise to stop. He looked at the countdown clock for the Aegis fleet's launch. It showed 10 minutes. He looked out the viewport at the silent, watching stars. The launch sequence continued, automated and relentless. But the men and women at their posts were no longer performing their duties with zealous pride. They moved like sleepwalkers, their faces etched with a dawning, horrified understanding. The countdown reached 0. On the planet below, and across the entire Imperium, billions of Cathar watched their screens, waiting for the thunder they had been promised. But the Aegis fleet did not launch. Its engines remained cold. Its space-time weapons remained dormant. Grand Marshal Kale, a being who had lived his entire life in a symphony of glorious war, stood on his bridge in a silence of his own making. And, for the first time, he was truly listening. The quiet that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of a question that now hung over every soul in the Imperium. What now? The silence of the Aegis fleet was a sound louder than any weapon it could have fired. It was a declaration of uncertainty, a crack in the monolithic facade of the Cathar Imperium. The non-launch was not a decision made by Grand Marshal Kale. It was a collective hesitation, a system-wide pause as billions of minds grappled with a truth that dismantled their history and their purpose. Kale, standing on the bridge of the silent Imperator, felt the throne of his authority crumble beneath him. He was a warrior without a war, a conductor whose orchestra had laid down their instruments. His enemy was not a fleet to be fought, but an idea that had already conquered the hearts and minds of his people. From the bridge, he could see the stray comet drifting away from the sync relay, a tiny, insignificant ship that had toppled an empire with a whisper. He could have ordered it destroyed, a final defiant roar against the encroaching quiet, but the gesture would have been hollow, a child's tantrum in the face of an unmovable truth. He let it go. Kira, Valerius, and Grusk watched the Aegis fleet from a safe distance, their own ship a pocket of absolute silence in the void. They had expected a battle, a purge, a violent reaction. They had not expected this. Stillness. It was more profound and more unsettling than any counterattack. "What have we done?" Valerius murmured, his face illuminated by the holographic display showing the inert fleet. "Have we saved them? Or have we merely broken them?" The answer came not from the Cathar, but from the void. In the space between the Aegis fleet and Cathar Prime, a ripple appeared. It was not a hyperspace tear or a wormhole, but a fold in the fabric of reality itself. From this fold emerged a single vessel. It was not a colossal dreadnought like the one Vorlog had encountered. This ship was smaller, impossibly elegant, shaped like a single, elongated teardrop forged from a material that seemed to both absorb and emit starlight. It had no visible engines, no weapons, no bridge. It was a perfect, seamless object, a piece of sculpture that moved with impossible grace, a human ship. It came to a stop, positioning itself precisely between the paralyzed fleet and the capital planet. It broadcast no message, made no demands. It simply waited. Its presence was an answer to the Imperium's unspoken question. It was the next note in the symphony. On Cathar Prime, the silence of the populace gave way to a quiet, frantic debate. The government was in chaos. Senators and ministers, stripped of their historical mandate for conquest, argued in hushed, urgent tones. Some called for surrender, others for a delayed, suicidal attack. They were a species defined by action, and the sudden imperative to do nothing was tearing them apart. Grand Marshal Kyle, abandoning his flagship, descended to the planet. He did not go to the High Command bunker or the Senate chambers. He went to the now public Kronos Vault, the epicenter of the Truth Plague. He walked through its silent halls, past the rows of data cores that now contained the history of their shame, and found the source of the upload. From there, he sent a single, encrypted message to a ghost profile of a long-dead cargo hauler. "You started this," the message read. "Tell me how it ends." Kira received the message as the stray comet drifted in a forgotten asteroid field. She looked at the human ship on her screen, a silent, beautiful arbiter floating in the void. She had shown her people a new sound, the sound of their own history. But the Spire had given her a condition, not a plan. Show us a new sound. It wasn't just about confessing the past, it was about composing the future. She understood now that the humans were not waiting for a surrender. Surrender was an act of war, an admission of defeat in a conflict they were not fighting. They were waiting for something else, something the Cathar had never learned to create a consensus. "They want us to choose," she said to Valerius. "Not Kyle, not the Senate, all of us. They're waiting for the Imperium to find a single, unified voice." Valerius's eyes widened. "But that's impossible. We are a billion different voices, a billion different ambitions. We have never agreed on anything without the threat of a plasma cannon." "Then we must learn," Kara replied, "or we will be harmonized." She responded to Kyle's message. "You cannot end this. You can only begin it. Open the channels, all of them. Let the people speak." It was a radical, insane idea in a rigidly hierarchical society. For centuries, the voice of the Cathar had been the voice of their leaders. To give the power of that voice to the masses was unthinkable. It was anarchy. But Kyle was a man standing on the edge of an abyss. He had nothing left to lose. He gave the order. The Imperial Broadcast Network, once a tool of propaganda and control, was opened. Every citizen was given a platform, a direct, unfiltered channel to the heart of the government. The first few hours were chaos, a torrent of fear, anger, and confusion. It was the noise the humans had come to silence. Kira watched, her heart sinking. She had been wrong. They were incapable of harmony. But then, something shifted. Amidst the shouting, a few voices began to speak of the Spire's message. Not the history, but the feeling, the shared pain of the galaxy. They spoke of the weariness they had felt, the hollowness of their conquests. These voices were quiet, but they were resonant. They were seeds of a new kind of thought. Valerius, using the stray comet's advanced systems, began to isolate these voices, amplifying them, weaving them together into a coherent signal. He became a digital composer, taking the discordant notes of his people and arranging them into a fledgling melody. He created forms for discussion, filtering out the rage and amplifying the reason. He was, in effect, teaching his species how to have a conversation. The debate raged for days. The human ship remained, a silent, patient observer. The Aegis fleet did not move. It had become a monument to their indecision. Kira knew she had one last role to play. She was the only Cathar who had stood before them, who had been judged and taught. She broadcast her own message, her face appearing on every screen in the Imperium. She didn't speak as a soldier or a fugitive. She spoke as a witness. For 500 years, we have been shouting into the dark, and we were angry that it did not answer, she said, her voice quiet but clear. We never considered that it was listening the entire time. The silence is not a void to be filled. It is a presence to be respected. The humans have not come to destroy our homes. They have come to ask us to be better neighbors. They've asked us to show them a new sound, not the sound of plasma fire, not the sound of marching feet, the sound of a people choosing to be quiet, choosing to listen. She then told them everything her journey, the spire, the truth of their history, and the simple, profound lesson of the stray comet's engine. She spoke not of gods and monsters, but of balance and consequence. She offered no solution, only a choice. Her message was the final catalyst. The debate coalesced. The fear and anger gave way to a profound, collective melancholy, a grief for the identity they had lost, and a fragile, terrifying hope for a new one they might build. A consensus began to form, not through a vote or a decree, but as a slow, rising tide of shared understanding. Finally, Grand Marshal Kyle, no longer a ruler but a representative, stood before the open channels. He wore no armor, no medals. He was just a single Cathar, speaking for his people. He did not address the human ship. He addressed the silent stars. "We have been loud," he said, his voice raw, stripped of all its former arrogance. "We filled the void with our pride and our pain because we were afraid of what we would hear in the quiet. We were afraid of ourselves. We do not ask for forgiveness. We ask for a chance to learn a new song." He paused, and in that pause, the entire Imperium held its breath. "We will be quiet now," he finished. As his last word echoed into silence, the human ship moved. It did not power up weapons or open a communication channel. The elegant, teardrop-shaped vessel simply turned and folded itself out of existence, vanishing as gracefully as it had arrived. It had heard them. The Aegis fleet remained in orbit, but its purpose was gone. It was no longer a weapon of conquest, but a relic, a reminder of a song they would no longer sing. The Cathar Imperium was dead. In its place stood the Cathar Chorus, a civilization facing the terrifying, exhilarating task of building a future out of the ashes of their past, armed not with weapons, but with the simple, powerful act of listening. Their first act was to send a message, not to the humans, but to the rest of the galaxy. It was a simple, humble broadcast containing the historical files from the Kronos Vault and a single, unadorned apology. They were laying down their instruments, stepping back from the orchestra, and, for the first time, just listening to the music. Kira, watching from the stray comet, finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. They had not won a war. They had averted an execution and, when doing so, had forced a soul-deep evolution upon their entire species. Valeria stood beside her, his old and tired eyes filled with a light she had never seen before. "It is a start," he said softly. "The first note in a much longer piece." Their work was not done. The galaxy was still being retuned, and other species were facing the same quiet judgment. But now, for the first time, a voice from the old, noisy world was speaking a language the silence might just understand. The years that followed were known as the Great Stillness. The Cathar did not fall into anarchy. They fell into introspection. The hierarchical structures of the Imperium, built for command and conquest, simply dissolved, becoming irrelevant. In their place, the open channels that Valerius had amplified became the new form of governance, a constant, flowing conversation, a collective consciousness they began to call the chorus. There was no single leader, only moderators and synthesizers, individuals like Valerius, who curated the endless stream of thought into coherent, actionable consensus. Grand Marshal Kale became one of the first moderators of reconciliation, his new role not to command fleets, but to guide the deconstruction of the Cathar war machine. The Aegis fleet was never launched. Instead, its components were painstakingly disassembled and repurposed. Its space-time weaponry was rendered inert, and its massive hulls were flown to barren worlds, where they were cracked open to become the foundational structures for new, self-sustaining ecosystems. The statues of conquerors were not torn down in anger, but gently removed and placed in museums of memory, their bronze faces serving not as inspiration, but as a quiet warning against the allure of noise. The Cathar chorus's apology to the galaxy was met, at first, with suspicion. Old enemies fortified their borders, expecting a trick, but the Cathar sent no diplomats, no fleets. They simply sent the truth, the unredacted files, the story of their own humbling. They also sent aid, ships, once designed for invasion, now arrived in systems suffering from famine or environmental collapse, their crews working in quiet efficiency to restore and retreat, asking for nothing in return. They were no longer trying to lead the orchestra. They were simply tuning the instruments of those who had been damaged by their former cacophony. On the stray comet, a quiet finality settled over its three mismatched occupants. Their purpose was fulfilled, their desperate mission complete, and they were now adrift in the new, quiet world they had helped create. Valerius was the first to find his new place. He returned to Cathar Prime, not as a disgraced heretic, but as a revered first listener. He took up residence in the Chronos Vault, transforming it from a library of imperial lies into an open forum for the chorus, spending his final years teaching the young how to listen, not just to each other, but to the subtle rhythms of the universe they had once tried to shout down. Grusk, the Zortan pilot, found he could no longer stand the bustle of even the newly quiet ports. His encounter with the Spire and the subsequent perfection of his ship had changed him. He became a whisper on the star lanes, his silent, hyper-efficient vessel a legend among the outer colonies. He ferried medical supplies to plague-stricken moons and transported refugees from dying stars, never speaking a word, never asking for payment. He was no longer a mercenary. He was a silent act of grace. His ship a testament to the fact that the most profound help often arrives without a sound. But Kira could not rest. While her people found solace in their new harmony, she was haunted by the Spire's final challenge, show us a new sound. She felt they had only offered a cessation of the old one. It was a beginning, but it was not a complete answer. The presence of the human ship, its patient and silent judgment, had imprinted itself on her soul. She felt a pull, a subtle resonance calling to her from the direction the teardrop vessel had vanished. She knew her journey was not over. She bid her two friends a quiet farewell and, Alone in the cockpit of the stray comet, she set a course for the heart of what had once been human space, chasing the echo of a silence. She traveled for months, passing through the newly composed systems, watching as the galaxy healed under humanity's invisible guidance. She saw suns being stabilized, worlds being terraformed with breathtaking speed, all without a single ship being seen. It was as if the universe itself was the tool, and the humans were the quiet will behind it. Finally, she arrived. It was not a star system, but a monument to engineering so vast it defied comprehension. A star, ancient and white, was encased in a latticework sphere of black, seamless material. A Dyson sphere, but it was not a power station. There were no energy emissions, no industrial ports. The surface of the sphere was alive with patterns of light that shifted and flowed like thought, a silent conversation on a stellar scale. As the stray comet approached, a single aperture opened in the sphere, a perfect circle of darkness that beckoned her inward. She flew her ship inside, and the universe vanished. She was floating in a space that was not a space, before a single, brilliant point of light. This was no star. It was a nexus, a confluence of consciousness. This was what humanity had become. You came. A chorus of thought washed over her, the combined voice of a billion souls, yet as calm and unified as a still lake. You are the first to listen so closely. Kira offered no thought in reply, only a feeling, a quiet, respectful curiosity. You wonder why? The voice continued, sensing her question. We did not retreat from cruelty. We retreated from entropy. Life, in its uncontrolled state, is a chaotic algorithm that inevitably terminates in self-destruction. The noise of your empires, your wars, your greed. It was the mathematical proof of your end. We did not intervene to punish you. We intervened to solve the equation. Images filled her mind, galaxies blooming and dying, species rising to dominance and annihilating themselves in fire, a repeating cycle of cosmic waste. She saw humanity itself on that same precipice, eons ago, their own noise threatening to tear them apart before they learned to silence themselves and truly listen to the universe. They had not transcended. They had survived. We are not gods, the consciousness explained. We are gardeners. We prune the branches that grow wild so that the tree itself may live. We silence the noise so that true music may have a chance to grow. Kyra understood at last. This was the final, profound truth. The silence wasn't the goal. It was the medium. It was the fertile soil from which a new, more stable, more beautiful form of life could emerge. Your species has sung its first new note. The voice concluded. It is fragile, but it is harmonious. The galaxy needs more such notes. You have a choice. You can stay here, join our watch, and add your consciousness to the silence, or you can return and become a composer for your people. You can teach them the song you have learned. Kira looked at the nexus of light, the offer of perfect, eternal, silent understanding. It was a peace beyond anything she had ever known. Then she thought of Valerius teaching children to listen, of Grisk's ship appearing like a silent prayer in a desperate sky. She thought of the Cathar chorus, a billion voices learning to speak as one. Their song was fragile. It needed a composer, a witness, a guide. She made her choice, not with a thought, but with a feeling of warmth, of purpose, of turning toward home. The nexus of light pulsed once, a gentle, silent farewell. The aperture of the Dyson sphere reappeared, showing her the path back to the familiar stars. When Kira returned to Cathar Prime, she was no longer a soldier or a fugitive. She was a traveler who had seen the far shore and returned with a map. She did not rule. She did not command. She simply joined the chorus and began to share her story, her voice adding a new, resonant depth to their evolving song. The galaxy never heard from humanity again. Not directly, but their presence was felt everywhere in the quiet efficiency of a trade route, in the stable orbit of a once erratic moon, in the gentle hum of a world brought back from the brink. The silence was their legacy, and in that great, cosmic quiet, new sounds began to emerge. The tentative, harmonious song of the Cathar, the intricate, mathematical poetry of a species that had abandoned greed, the gentle, psychic hum of a people freed from zealotry. The galaxy was no longer a screaming chaos. It was becoming a symphony, composed one quiet note at a time. And Kyra, the girl who had once sought glory in the roar of an empire, found her true purpose in the whisper of its rebirth. She had listened to the silence, and in it, she had found the future.